And welcome to this session as part of the broader thematic on how we can finance a transition and growth. The session title is Engagement and Divestment, but let's just cut. This is about the pensions industry. This is about education in the pensions industry. It's giving people choices, it's giving people knowledge, it's laying the foundations with metrics that people can understand and giving them incentives as well. And that's just the pensions industry. Add on to that a layer about making people empowered to make sustainable decisions as well. And you understand we've got a real complicated issue because I think we have a great panel here of people who can explain to you how difficult it is to engage people in the pension story, let alone engage them in a pension story that then looks at engaging in sustainability and divesting from companies that do not want to go on the journey that a lot of us obviously here at COP26 know has to be done to get everyone to net zero and to far more sustainability within the finance industry. I've spent a lot of time over the last 48 hours talking to people about how the money has to be there. The money has to be there from government, but it's the private sector, as Mark Carney has been pointing out for a very long time now, that will provide the trillions, whereas the governments will potentially provide the billions as well. Let me just go straight into the panel. By the way, my name is Steve Sedgwick. I'm a news anchor at CNBC. I've been in and around financial markets, first as a practitioner and then as a journalist for 33 years, which means I know absolutely next to nothing about pensions. I know a thing or two about energy. I know a thing or two about derivatives and markets and a little bit about politics as well. So I am in your hands, panel, to educate me about this issue and how the money, which is there, we know the money's there, can make itself sustainable and fund what is going to be a fantastic transition. In no particular order, I'm just going to tell you who's on this panel. Mr. Coffey, of course, is the MP for Suffolk Coast, I believe, which is covering some of the most brilliant parts of the world, including Southwold and Albury, and wonderful places. Well, you also just happen to be the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. So thank you very much indeed, Therese, for joining us as well. Andy Curran next to me is also a very important man at Phoenix Group, at Standard Life. In fact, he's so important. He's got so many titles. I'm just going to call you the CEO of Standard Life for now because the other one's just way too long. Your business cards are enormous as well. Tony Burdon is sitting on our far right here, or camera left, I should say. He's the CEO of Make My Money Matter. You have been a civil servant, but you've also been involved in many NGOs as well and are doing an enormous amount of work in the education. And by no means least, in fact, thank you very much indeed, Georgia, for joining us as well. Georgia Stewart is the CEO of Tumelo as well. Again, doing an enormous amount of work, providing platforms with some of the biggest insurers out there, the likes of Legal & General, the likes of Viva, platforms that actually help with some of those things I mentioned at the top, and that is educating people, giving them choices, and making the whole mystique of pensions a little bit more easier to understand. Right, that is an enormous introduction. There are a whole, go very simply to the Secretary of State, Therese, and just say to you, what is the government doing in the United Kingdom to not only make pensions more accessible, to more easy to understand, because we know there is an engagement problem throughout the world, let alone in the United Kingdom as well, but also adding a layer, Therese, and I think this is very complicated, to people understand that there are sustainable choices that need to be made as well.
Well, thanks for that. And of course, the success of the UK pensions industry has been augmented by something called the auto-enrolment of people are automatically, before it's even left their salary, chipping into their future. I think one of the things that's special about the pensions industry is it has to generate a return for the future, but it can take that long-term approach, which is why the alignment with helping to manage the transition to net zero suits it really well. And that's why we've taken an approach in our regulations about reflecting the fact that the risk of what could happen with climate change to the companies in which they're investing has to be accounted for. And one of the key things is then about helping consumers understand about how their pension pot is at risk or actually could be rewarded by the investment decisions that then get made. So it's important that we've laid out these regulations. We'll continue to consult and try and unblock the hurdles that may still be there in order to make sure that pensions can get a good return for people, but also a good return for the planet. I should make the point, Georgia, and I've said this to everyone who's here physically as well, that by all means, if you hear something from the Secretary of State or anyone indeed, just I want this to be a very fluid panel. I'll just ask one more quick question as well. You mentioned the word unblock as well.
are there blockages that are very obvious that you and the rest of the team and the Treasury and others can work really hard on unblocking before we even get to the hurdles that are created by switching to more sustainable assets?
One of the things that's been said to us in the past, particularly about defined contribution assets, where people can move their pension pots quite readily, which doesn't really happen in the defined benefit world where it's attached more to your employer, is that the liquidity challenges there put off and investment managers looking into kind of that longer term investment. So we are, as the Chancellor has said at the budget, we're going to announce a consultation, or he's announced that, we'll be publishing that in the next few weeks. In particular, one thing about that asset managers can invest in illiquid assets in a more straightforward way, particularly from the private equity industry. But we need to be careful, and we want to make sure this is good for savers as well, in terms of aspects of making sure charges and there's a good return. But I think the most important thing that we can continue to do, we've set the regulations for the industry, we need to help them with their performance metrics. I'll be focusing on is how we can help with the stewardship and the trustees, because ultimately they have a duty to their members, they have got a duty to the people who are saving with them, and they need to generate that return as well as make that contribution to transition to net zero.
Brilliant. Georgia, I'm going to bring you in after Andy, and then I'll bring Tony in at the end of that as well. But if I may, the government and Phoenix and Standard Life, you represent the establishment. If I may, Georgia and Tony, perhaps the disruptors there as well, or certainly helping our education as well. From the pensions industry point of view, what are the biggest barriers at the moment, Andy, to actually not only increasing the engagement with pensions, but also on a sustainable basis?
Just to build on some of the things that Therese has said, I think we all have to work together on this. So government, the industry, regulators, and working with the consumer and ultimately the end client. The example that Therese just gave around illiquid assets and the appropriateness of them and how easy that is for your regular DC pension saver through these types of assets is very difficult at the moment. You've got unit pricing challenges, you've got liquidity challenges and so on and so forth. So if we can work with all stakeholders, regulators, how do you solve that conundrum? I think that's really, really important for us. So that's the DC bit. Why is that important? We'll give you an idea of the scale of how much money is falling into that DC environment at the moment. There's about £40 billion per annum that's going in, so this is not small. There's about 30 billion transitioning into at or in retirement. Again, not a small amount of money. So thinking as a life company in particular, the other thing we're interested in is sort of illiquid long-term investing, because we have long-tail liabilities, because we're writing annuity business for 30, 40-year duration. So it's in our interest to find ways of working with the government, regulators and the like to make sure that we can offer as broad a suite of green investments as we possibly can.
I'm very conscious that we're talking about itself rather than the sustainable angle on it as well. But you've worried me straight away, Andy. I'll be honest with you. Liquid long-term liabilities and assets as well. The enemy of that is mark-to-market, of course, because if you mark-to-market a lot of this stuff on a near-term basis, it is terrifying of what these assets look like as well. But there is a liquid long-term liabilities and assets that they never get marked at the right price, and then hence the pension holders are going to be in a big problem. Yeah,
so these are the types of things to work together to solve.
Well, I presume we are working.
We are working together, so we're working with the ABI, we're working with FCA, PRA, Treasury and the like to think, how do we solve these problems? Because they are really important from a society perspective, savings perspective, etc. So it's a really big issue for us.
Okay, I thought you were going to reassure me. Georgia, I'm actually more terrified now because I think that the investment opportunities are fantastic. Again, what's the number Mark Carney said? Up to $150 trillion needs to be invested in green and sustainable assets over the next 30 years. Amazing opportunities, Georgia. But again, if a lot of this stuff is illiquid and long-term, it's very worrying for the kind of clarity which you're trying to create.
I think, what we do at Tumelo is we help people to see what companies their pension is invested in and to have a say on the ESG, environmental, social governance issues that those companies are facing. Now, we actually do focus on the public markets at the moment because it's very easy for us to get data because of some of the things that so we can very easily tell someone that they have X percentage of Tesla in their pension and that Tesla has an AGM coming up and there's a question on human rights and what do they think about that issue, because all of that information is public, and so we can really easily feed it into their pension experience. One of the things that's harder for us is to get data on any of the private assets, illiquid assets that someone might have in their pension, because the data is not standardized and often the data sets are not there. That said, underlying pension members that we talk to, and we're doing user testing with members on a weekly or 2-weekly basis, say that they want their money to be invested in, illiquid assets. Obviously, they don't use that language, but they love the idea of investing their pension in something down the road. And they want to know about it, they want to feel proud of their money and feel like it's aligned with their values. And we can do that to an extent using public markets. We can help people understand that they're invested in companies that are doing amazing things, like Unilever, for example, or others. But to an extent, we're limited because what people really want is to know that they're investing in their community. So I do think the underlying beneficiaries want what we're talking about, and obviously there are challenges we need to overcome to make that possible for them.
Do you want to come in on something, George?
Just to say, on where you have that public information, we would be saying the industry would look at that and it's very, very clear. The tricky bit is where it's newer assets, where you have that pricing problem just to get that proper look through. Mm-hmm. But everything else you said, that Georgia was saying, I'd agree with, and we see that through, we have over 3.3 million customers in our corporate pensions world. We see that it's growing. Another interesting factor around this is actually most people end up falling into it, which is another tricky issue. So the question for the industry, enrollment and is to think about, well, what does that actually mean? What's the makeup of your default fund? If 98% of your members are going to that default fund, what can we as an industry do to maybe make that a bit more, have a bit of ESG content? So to give you an example of what we were doing, our own ESG, our own default fund at the moment has moved from an ESG compatible of about 60% to over 80%. And that's just in the space of 1 year. So that's a significant move. And to give you an idea of the size of that, that's about 25 billion of assets. So the challenges are similar, and it's getting to that front end that's important.
Before Tony comes in, Georgia, just let's come back to this as well. I want to explore a little bit more that private sector, because something that, funnily enough, Andy and I just mentioned off camera before this panel was de-equitisation, and the fact that many, many companies, because, dare I say it, interest rates are so low and so much capital can find homes not on equity markets, it is really, really easy to grow very big companies, unicorns, decacorns, centicorns? I think maybe centicorns in the private sector as well. So that's going to be an even bigger challenge for you at Tumelo and for Tony as well, to disseminate the information as well. How are you going to cross that Rubicon? How are you going to get over that barrier?
Well, I guess there's benefits in it, though, for the companies at the end of the line. You know, we're not working against the companies. The companies themselves, or those that are aligned to the transition we're trying to make, want to engage all of their stakeholders, including their underlying investors. But also those underlying investors, let's remember, are the same people as the consumers often that they're serving and the citizens who they're affecting. So, I mean, from our perspective, we focus on listed equities because it's easy to get the data, and we're only 12 months old in terms of how long our product's been in the market. But we absolutely have an intention to start building in the possibility for users to see what private assets they hold as well, and to bring that to life for them. And obviously the data's not as standardized, but you know, we have a lot of technology. I don't think it's necessarily a big barrier to help people understand where their money's going.
Brilliant, thank you, Georgia. Tony, you've been waiting very patiently, and so please just jump in on this one.
Yeah, so on our side, what we know from our surveys is that 80% of people who have a pension in the UK don't even know that it's invested. So we're starting from a really low base level.
Hang on a second, 80% don't know that it's invested?
They just think it gets interest.
Yeah.
And
you know,
you came up. Sorry to interrupt you, but Andy, you had your figure was even lower than that, but it's
really?
80% of people.
So
similar.
There's a real lack of knowledge about how this all works. Birds say that they would like a sustainable pension. You know, 70% don't want their pension to drive climate change. They want it to tackle climate change. So there's a huge demand here to learn more, and for their money to be doing the right things. So how do we get there is the challenge then. So there's a big education challenge, and engagement is hard because with a defined benefit scheme you just got a final salary pension, you didn't need to worry about it. Now it's your money, as Therese said, auto-enrolled, it's your money being invested. So what we've been calling for is for the default fund to be aligned to net zero. So this is the first basic thing, do no harm. So make sure your portfolio is aligned to net zero. And then you need to start thinking of investing in these climate solutions, the many trillions that Mark Carney describes. So that's
the default is you will donate your organs, is the point. You don't have.
That's right. So like Andy said, most people stay in the default. They trust their employer, they trust the pension provider to offer them something that's the right thing.
Well, that's a great start. And what's the barrier to that then? That sounds unbelievably logical.
We're already doing it, I think.
But maybe you are, but others aren't.
Yep.
So the default in the past has been driving the climate emergency. Our pensions have helped create the world.
Well, hang on a second. Well, let's get the Secretary of State on this. Is this? Do we want? I know you're a Conservative, so you don't want big government or too big government. But is this a place where actually the government, Theresa, should come in and say, yeah, we can do this. We can make that the default situation.
Well, there's a number of things. One is about sports, so that will be happening. It's going to take a little bit of time to pull it all together. The other element is about, as I say, we've introduced the regulations, so the reporting will be coming through. So how we try and get that aligned to the Paris goal, the ambition of 1.5 degrees. And I think one of the things where a part of this discussion you want to have today is engagement, but also the challenge about divestment. I think what is fair to say, pension funds just pull the plug tomorrow on some of the big energy companies. We won't get to net zero in the same way, because but that said, those energy companies that are not showing that path clearly towards getting to net zero, that will come forward in the risk they're factored into the pricing or what people want to put into that particular pension fund with the trustees, and that's where that journey we are on. And actually, we're leading the way in terms of that regulation. % of DC schemes are already part of a net zero commitment. So we're certainly well along the way. And one of the things I'm trying to do this week is see some people from other parts of the world where there are significant DC benefits, to see what we can do to bring that regulation in approach across the country, but across the world rather. But you know, there are some metrics that we can get into. There's a plethora of them at the moment. That could be there.
We've got Mark Carney to thank for all the extra acronyms he's given me in the last
last
couple of weeks.
All the different TCFDs and all that, but very clearly is a key theme of this COP, and things like the implied temperature rise metric is again something that is measurable.
Everybody
and can
wants
be
to come
managed.
in on this one. So Tony, you go first. Andy and Georgia, you'll come after that. I'm sure you want to contribute to that.
So like Therese said, most of the DC schemes have committed to robust net zero targets, which is fantastic. Standard Life, one of those. But what we've also seen is a lot of the old defined benefit schemes haven't. So there's over 800 billion in assets now committed to be aligned to net zero in UK pension schemes, but just under 2 trillion that isn't. So this is why we've called on government to make net zero mandatory for pension schemes. We understand the old DB schemes, some are heavily de-risked, have less equities and so on. But still, there's keeping 1.5 degrees alive, there's also delivering it. I think we're in a climate catastrophe right now.
Yep.
And that's at 1.1 degrees. Just think what it's going to be like.
2.7 by the end of the century, according to the UN. Andy, then Georgia.
Yeah, just 2 very quick points. It's interesting, I agree with Tony. People, interestingly enough, don't think they're investing when they're in a pension. They just don't. But equally, those who have a pension believe that it's invested in line with their own beliefs and attitudes.
But it's not going to happen by magic, is
but,
it?
But it's really interesting.
They need Tony and Georgia to tell them that.
They need the industry as it is also to tell them that, because there's a real opportunity. But if the industry was telling them that, and then I'm getting moderately combative here, but if the industry was doing their job, there would be no need for Georgia and Tony. Well, the industry has made massive strides over a number of years, so TCFD makes a big difference. Bear in mind, the industry has a fairly big, what I would describe as intermediated players. So employers will have a view, trustees will have a view, things like that, who will be professional people looking at this, thinking, how does this fit with the company, the values, and so on and so forth. So all of that has made a huge difference over I would say, actually, over the last 3 to 5 years. So there's been significant change, but lots to do.
So, George, you're working very hard on the engagement. You're working very hard on the information on public companies as well. I mean, you must see then what people are doing once they have that extra information. Are they taking the steps to disinvest from hydrocarbons? Are they finding sustainable investments? Are they looking? I think it was you mentioned Unilever. What are they actually doing?
Yeah, so I guess we are really pro engagement. And the title of this was engagement versus divestment. And what our platform really does is hold the industry, asset managers specifically, accountable for voting and engaging with the companies that people are invested in. And I think Therese was saying that earlier, we can't just pull the plug on the big fossil fuel companies, but if shareholders were doing their job right, we wouldn't have the problem that we do have with fossil fuel companies, we would argue. And I think the fact of the matter is that although there's been a lot of focus on ESG, there hasn't been enough focus on stewardship. And actually, as shareholders, these large pension funds are big shareholders, along with the rest of the industry, in the companies that we're trying to change. And so you may, as a consumer, feel like you want to kind of hold up your bastion, but actually, if you as a shareholder can be represented in line with your values, then you have probably a better chance at making change from the top of the S&P 500 than right at the bottom as a consumer. And so really what our platform is trying to do is get people engaged on the issues that shareholders are having a choice on and being able to vote on human rights, but also gender equality and ultimately climate change, as we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And that's really where we believe if we can increase engagement from pension members, we can benefit them in terms of their outcomes, in terms of how much they're investing, how aligned they feel, how engaged they are with their pension, which is going to improve their financial future, but also it's going to improve their environmental future, or our collective environmental future, because we're going to hold the industry accountable to doing more when it comes to stewardship and pushing companies harder, because it's what their underlying beneficiaries want.
We also know from our surveys, and maybe Standard Life have the same, but 52% of people have said they would save more if they knew their pension was good. That's
exactly where I wanted to go next. Tell me about this.
When we want to, we're all worried about a future savings crisis for young people. Are they going to save enough? So part of that solution is engaging them with their pension, understanding that it is aligned to their values, it's doing the right things. And then, what I hope is that they see that as something they put money in through their lives that helps build the world that they then retire into, and a world for their children.
Absolutely. And savings would become there for their children, for their grandchildren as well. Yeah. So why in the year where I started this year talking to all arms of my organisation and saying very vociferously to them, this is going to be about sustainability this year. Every one of our partners, every one of our commercial partners, every one of our corporate partners, every business we speak to is going to want to talk about sustainability. On that basis, why is it that there is a communications problem? Tony, you start this one off and then we'll go through everyone, because I agree, it seems unambiguous. I think we all must agree, George and Therese, that if we thought we were doing a better thing, we would all save more.
So forgive me if I say that, pension communications are a bit 19th century maybe, or 20th if you're being generous.
Or a bit actuarial,
So yeah, 30 pages of stuff, you've just got to either bin it or put it in the bottom drawer. So that's where people are. It's really difficult to understand. So I think part of that is modernising it.
Are you disrupting on that front? Are you doing enough in that to explain simplicity of how it should be? There's
a nice little pension scheme, Cushion. It's a little master trust scheme. And they're a fintech, so they're quite clever. Yeah. But they've got a wonderful app for their pension. So when money goes in at the end of the month, it throws out confetti. You just got money. Who wouldn't be curious?
Sounds like my premium bonds when I don't win every month.
So their employers put money in, but then you can start to see where is your money going. Yeah. You've got the Tumelo platform in there, so you can start to see the portfolio. They've even got videos from, they're investing in some offsetting reforestation, mangrove
So it's all there to see.
And you can see videos of birds' nests that are part of the offsetting scheme that they're using. So I think that's building engagement using modern tools. People use their phones for everything.
They do, indeed.
And as Therese said, the pensions dashboard is another opportunity. We've asked government to require pension funds to report their impact. So where are they on their emissions, on their environmental deforestation impact, to have all of those things so that people can look at their pension and think, what does it cost? What am I getting in the future? And what's my pension
It sounds
doing
simple and it sounds novel and it sounds, as you say, quite fun as well. Georgia, is that your experience as well? Make it fun, make it simple, and people will engage and they will invest accordingly and actually want to save more.
Yeah, I have to say, my team also use the cushion pension, so I agree with Tony on that. But yeah, completely. You know, we've built a platform that's super intuitive, and it talks to people about things they're interested in. I also think we need personalisation, because although 98% of people are in the default fund, you're not going to have 98% of people be interested in the same thing about the default fund, and that's something about ESG as well. You know, it's very subjective. And so if we can have smart notification systems and personalisation of the user experience, I think we'd be successful. Think about kind of Netflixing the pension. So, for example, on our platform, people can come on and say, interested in climate change and plastic pollution, and they'll only get emails about climate change and plastic pollution, asking them to contribute on those issues specifically. Or you could come on and say, we're really passionate about CEO pay equality. And so we're not trying to fit everyone into the same and really be smart about segmentation and personalization. Automation, all of those are possible, and the pension provider really keen to. It's just a question of moving faster, I think.
So I think one of the things about trying to understand different measures, which is what, you know, we're on that journey now. I think the risk is having a plethora of measures. While I appreciate what George just said about the you know, different aspects of the ESG will appeal to different savers, we need to try and have I'd say a more straightforward way that ultimately the game is to achieve this. And the pension funds may end up doing that in a variety of ways. Yeah. So they may have a spread of their different investments on what they're achieving, or you might get one that goes particularly focusing on one area. But overall, I think it's that more of an alignment that we're heading towards.
Yeah. So I agree with everything that's been said. There's a couple of things. The bigger players in the market can bring to bear significant pressure and engagement with, you know, the underlying investors, who you're investing with, underlying companies. Now they're thinking about their own carbon footprint, as an example. Within Phoenix, we've committed to where we have credit and equity, where we have direct control over that. We're looking at over 160 billion of assets, looking to reduce the carbon footprint there by 2025, I think it is, by 25%. So we're making our scale and our presence felt. The other challenge around engagement, I think Tony is right. I think the rest of the panel are right. The pensions per se, far less, you know, the underlying nuances of it are very, very hard for people to get their head around. We were having this conversation beforehand. Absolutely. And it's incumbent on us to work really hard, both education, information, what works. So we have our own talking statements where people don't engage with long, dry pension actuarial information. Yep. So one of the challenges that I think, Steve, we've had over a number of years is the industry tends to have a habit of wanting the consumer to come to us and speak our language. I think what we have to do, in particular to engage younger people probably, is to go to them and speak their language and engage with them in the ways they want to. Yeah. And that requires a lot of work by all. Well,
let's come back to the demographic, because that is absolutely the key. We're getting younger people into pensions as early as possible. And that's something that all of us know is the case, and hopefully we're encouraging our children to do so. But Therese, I just want to come back to one point you just made there, and you said, and I thought it was nuanced. You said, I appreciate what everyone is doing pretty much, and what Georgia and Tony and everyone are doing, but actually the future, the key is alignment as well. I think what you're saying is, yes, it's great that there are lots of measures out there, but if we're really going to be able to measure companies and industries and institutions on that, we need to actually have metrics where it's all aligned rather than all different metrics out there from lots of different private players.
I think this is where they're trying to head towards performance metrics that are readily understandable. And as I say, there'll be different contributions that you can make as part of your pension fund on how to get to the 1.5 degrees, or to limit it to 1.5 degrees. So, but that's the part of the information that should come out on how your direct investment will contribute towards that. Yeah. And it may be its only thing in life is to plant trees and get the return from aspects of that. But I've got the feeling people want to spread their elements more, but we need to help them with that journey. But the key thing for me at the moment now is we've got the regulations in place. That's got to take a little bit of time to bed in. But as was referred to earlier, we're turning our attention to trying to help the trustees along that journey, because their principal fiduciary duty, that's their principal duty, is fiduciary duty. And DB is a different sort of relationship to DC, I would say. But nevertheless, the two are in no way mutually exclusive. In fact, they're absolutely complementary.
People switch off on DC. I think if they think their money's safe on the DB, they really don't get too involved. Tony, you wanted to come back on that?
No, but I like what Therese is saying about, what you want is standardised information. So there's also comparability.
So just confirm, NGO agrees with UK government, yes?
Yeah. Okay. I think the government's done a great job on pushing for disclosure.
Good.
So TCFD, more disclosure. The government led on getting the IFRS to report and exploring accounting for sustainability. Mm-hmm. So starting with, on TCFD disclosures, but it will go wider. Yep. So what I hope, and I think what we'll get, is all businesses, will have their financial accounts, but also their impact account. And that will set out the impacts of the business, and that will allow investors to make choices. It's going to take time, but we'll get to a stage where, on your app on your phone, you'll know the impact of your pension fund. Yeah. And you'll decide to yourself, do I want to be in that fund? Do I want to ask it to do better? Or do I switch?
But it relies on, as Secretary of State was saying, on those aligned metrics that we can all trust and we can all see as a basis. And then we can go off and look at the ones we want on Tumelo, or look at the ones we want on your side as well. Andy, you wanted to come in?
No, just to say, my experience with the professional advisors, trustees, and the like in the market. These things are becoming much, much higher profile, which is really encouraging, and there's work to be done all over the place, of course. But a lot of work has been done, which is really impressive. From my perspective, keeping that level of engagement really high is really important. So if you can get the people, the employer, the trustees, to really help people understand what they've got and what steps they should be taking to think about their future, as they go through the retirement journey, is really, really important. It's just keeping that fresh all the time.
I want to ask you all a slightly different question, because we've talked a lot about the engagement side of it, as George was saying, that's part of it. But the divestment side, we've alluded to it as well. But I want to just share with you something that happened to me this morning. I spoke to Bernard Looney this morning on the third quarter numbers out from BP. I believe Bernard Looney is a good man. I believe that Ben van Burdon is a good man. I've known them both for a very long time, and I think they are trying to do the right thing. There are a lot of people who is in this grouping here at COP26 and outside of COP26 will say that is sacrilege, what I said. I think they are genuinely trying to do the right thing with the companies. They are huge contributors to UK pensions as well. As Lord John Brown always used to remind me, shows how long I go back with BP as well. How do we look at these kind of companies? They are an oil company. They have big investments in Russia. They have big investments in gas. They don't always operate in environments that any environmentalist would think is acceptable at all. How do we approach companies like that, where we think that people are doing the right thing, but it's the speed of action that is the biggest question as well? Let's just go through as well. And I'll start off with you, Therese, actually, because I think the relationship between the international oil companies, or energy companies, I should say, and government is ambiguous. It has always been very, very complicated as well. And I would say it's complicated because I didn't think that any of them were welcome up here during this conference, and I think that's why Bernard Looney didn't come up.
Well, I think they should feel welcome to have come to COP26, and it won't be the first time that energy companies have been at this event. I mean, I've been to the last two physical meetings of COP, and it's key that in a way they are not put off coming, because they are definitely part of the solution. And I don't know the individual reasons on what happened there, but I think it's important to stress they have to be on that journey, though. And that will come through in terms of the disclosure and the risk assessments, which their investors will be doing. And if they're not keeping up with the pace, then that will then be an element of shareholders taking that challenge and the investors having that strategic chat. So I really do hope that any energy company who's here, especially the scale we're talking about, would want to be part of this journey. Of course, some have chosen certain kind of ways of getting to that more quickly, whether that's about nuclear, whether it's about renewables in a different way. But I believe we have to have them as part of that journey.
And
as long as they are,
aren't they?
dare I say it, they're definitely on the bus and not the ones trying to stop the bus.
Yeah, and I should say BP is here, but the CEO just didn't feel it was right to be here as well. Andy?
It's the same. They should be part of the solution. I think I heard it on radio this morning, the results, and I think they described it as kind of riding two horses.
Yeah.
Yes, part of the solution, I would have thought, it's too big to ignore.
Georgia, how do people feel when they look at your site and you put in big energy company?
I mean, we haven't had the negative reaction that I think that some of the providers were worried about in the first instance. People are intrigued and they want to know that their asset managers are having the right conversations with those businesses. And that can be done. I mean, we saw Engine Number One launched a shareholder campaign in December against Exxon. Many of the asset managers here in the UK came out ahead of that vote and said they were going to side with Engine Number One and vote for new climate-focused directors to join the board of Exxon. And the asset managers don't usually disclose how they're going to vote ahead of an AGM. So that was unusual. And those 3 directors got removed from Exxon and new ones got replaced. So I think that as the others have said, these fossil fuel companies, they can be on a journey, but as shareholders or at least asset managers representing underlying owners, we need to make sure that we're holding them accountable. And unless they are on the right journey, then we need to try harder and collaborate and make sure that we can create change, like we have seen this year. And Exxon is one example, but we've had many examples of shareholder power.
And I know their whole strategy got changed in the courts because activist investors forced them to I think it was The Hague. It's Theresa.
Well, I was just going to say, I know my pensions minister, Guy Opperman, has really been pushing for shareholders to make their voices known in terms of getting that message across from the big investors. And I think we are seeing that really happening far more. And it might still be early days, but it's already having noticeable consequences.
Okay. Tony, quick answer, then I'm going to go a final round.
Yeah, totally agree. Use your pension superpower to help build the world you're going to retire into. And that engagement as a shareholder is absolutely fundamental. And I think in the past, it's not been exercised with enough power and in an organised way. But I think now, as we align to net zero, shareholders are going to come together and drive that transition in companies or exit from them if they're completely unwilling to do so.
Okay, I've got a final round. I've got, as long as we like, because it's a final round. My final question to all of you is, most optimistic scenario out of COP26 for the pensions industry, for the engagement in that industry on a sustainable basis, or actually your biggest concerns? So you can be optimistic or you can show me your biggest concern. And I'll start off with the Secretary of State.
Well, I'm optimistic. I'm meeting several groups for the time I'm here. I'm also trying to make some progress, as I was said early on, with international colleagues, because it's important that we are recognising investment as a global situation, and we can all move along that journey together. And I'm quite happy that the UK is leading the pack, but we'd like more people along with us.
Tony, why don't you go next?
I'm worried, but I think we've got leading schemes paving the way in terms of setting an example of what needs to be done. But there's a big job to do to bring the others with us. And that's why we've said, net zero's got to be mandatory. We can't afford to wait for disclosures in the future. We need to act now. Or like David Attenborough says, it'll be too late.
It will be too late for our children and grandchildren who also are going to need pensions. Georgia, why don't you come in next?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I mean, we've had a refresh of the UK Stewardship Code recently. The government's consultation, the Task Force for Pension Scheme Voting Implementation has come out, and we're actually seeing industry react as well. BlackRock announced a couple of weeks ago that they're going to allow split voting in some of the pension funds who invest with them, i.e. allowing others to have a look in on stewardship. And so, for me, I think if we continue on the trajectory that we have and over the pace that we have during 2021, then we can see a lot of change, specifically on that shareholder engagement piece, which I think is really, really important and has been underappreciated over the last 10 years whilst we've talked a lot about ESG.
Thank you, Georgia. Final word with you, Andy.
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, really enthusiastic, actually.
Good.
Really positive.
It's 3.5. I thought we were going to have a score draw here.
No, absolutely not. I think we have a coalition of the willing that we shouldn't let drop.
Yep.
So all the key stakeholders in the industry should be working as a collective to address the issues. So the industry, the traditional industry as you would see it, the regulator, government and the consumer, if we're all working together, I see a really bright future, actually.
Well, that's great. And that is really good because we need knowledge, we need metrics, we need innovation, we need incentives, and people will save more as well, which we didn't even talk about pension time bomb, but that's a conversation for another time. Let me just thank all of you indeed. Secretary of State Therese Coffey, thank you very much indeed for that. Andy Curran, CEO of Standard Life. That's a shorter version as well. Thank you very much indeed. Georgia Stewart, the CEO of Tumelo, thank you very much indeed. We didn't have any glitches as well. I was terribly worried about that. Most of my Zoom calls have been horrendous. And Tony Burdon, CEO of Make My Money Matter as well. It's been a real pleasure meeting all of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Steve.